A young woman with a metal leg limps into a crowded cafe. Every table turns her away until she stops in front of a silent Navy SEAL and whispers, "Can I sit here?" He nods once, but the moment she sits, her sleeve slides back, revealing bruises she tries to hide. His eyes narrow. Bear, his loyal German shepherd, shifts closer, sensing danger no one else sees. Outside, a shadow lingers in the snow. The girl breathes faster. If he finds me, I won't survive this time. The SEAL leans forward, voice low, steady, unshakable. Then, he'll have to go through me first. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow drifted through Spokane's winter morning, soft enough to hide the city's scars, heavy enough to make everything feel suspended. James Walker reached the coffee shop without really deciding to go there. His boots found the way, as if some old memory were tugging at the strings that still held him upright. Inside, warmth pressed against the windows, blurring the reflected world outside, and for a moment he let himself believe the glass was separating him from everything he wished he could forget. He stood still at the entrance longer than he intended. Bear brushed past his leg, silent, certain, moving with the confidence of something that never doubted why it existed. The dog settled near the table James always chose, close to the window, where he could watch the street but not be watched in return. James removed his gloves, sat down, and wrapped his hands around the warm mug he never finished. He wasn't really drinking coffee. He was holding something warm to remind himself he was still capable of feeling warmth at all. His uniform, AOR2 camo jacket, tactical pattern pants, boots scuffed from years of moving through places where doors didn't lock, felt heavier indoors than outside. He loosened the collar slightly, but it didn't help. The weight wasn't fabric. He breathed out slowly, watching condensation fade into air. The silence inside him didn't match the low hum of voices around. There were conversations, laughter, spoons stirring cups, but they felt like distant echoes from a world that didn't require armor just to make it through the morning. Part of him longed for that world. Another part didn't trust it. He tried to read, but the words slid off his mind. His thoughts wandered to places he didn't want to revisit. Empty barracks at dusk, a corridor of shadows where names written on plaques meant someone wasn't coming home, a reflection in a military mirror he barely recognized, eyes that asked questions he no longer dared answer. Bear shifted, not out of restlessness, but out of instinct. James followed the dog's gaze before he realized why. The door opened, and Winter came in with her. A young woman stepped inside, breath trembling as the sudden warmth hit her. She paused the way someone does when they're deciding whether to stay or flee. Her hands gripped a metal crutch tightly, and the faint clink of her prosthetic leg against the floor followed each step, steady but strained. She wore clothes meant to warm, but not enough to convince the cold to leave her bones. James looked down, feeling the old reflex flare. Observe without staring, assess without assuming. But his thoughts didn't follow the rules anymore. Something about her posture, tired but refusing to fold, pulled at a place in him he thought had gone numb. He told himself not to get involved. He'd made that promise before. You've done enough. Let others carry the load. But the voice that once sounded like discipline now felt like cowardice. The young woman approached the first occupied table, a polite refusal. She gave a small nod, half apology, half retreat, and moved on. At the next table, conversation fell silent before she spoke. The two men there shook their heads without meeting her eyes. At the third table, a woman with a stroller pulled her child close, gaze narrowing with suspicion disguised as concern. The young woman's shoulders tightened, barely perceptible, but enough for James to see the years of swallowed words behind the motion. Bear turned his head again as if asking silently, "Are we just watching?" James swallowed. He hated that question. The young woman made it halfway across the shop before stopping in front of his table. She stood there longer than necessary, maybe rehearsing, maybe bracing. Her voice, when it came, was soft yet steady, like someone used to being ignored but not broken. "Is this seat taken?" The question was ordinary. Everything behind it was not. James nudged the opposite chair with the toe of his boot, a small gesture, but his voice followed, quiet yet firm. "No, you can sit." Her relief was subtle, almost invisible, just a flicker of breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. As she lowered herself into the seat, her prosthetic leg knocked gently against the chair. She stiffened, swallowing embarrassment James recognized too well, the tension of being aware of your own presence like it was an intrusion. Bear rose, took 2 steps, and sat beside her, not touching, not crowding, but placing himself there with the solemn intention of a vow. His eyes softened, but his focus sharpened. "I see you. I am here." The young woman blinked, startled not by fear but by the strange comfort of being acknowledged without hesitation. She rested the crutch against the chair, looked out the window as if searching for something she couldn't name. James didn't speak. He let the silence breathe. He used to fill silences with orders and warnings. Now he let them sit, quiet spaces where someone else might place their truth if they chose. After a while she said quietly, "I've been on the move." Spokane wasn't the plan, but sometimes you end up where you need to be before you know why. James took a sip of his coffee, not because he wanted it, but because he needed a moment to steady his voice. "I know the feeling." She glanced at him, a question lingering behind her eyes, but she didn't ask it. Instead, she turned toward the window again, watching people pass through the snowfall, bundled against the cold, unaware of how fragile warmth could be. James studied the way her fingers curled slightly at each sound, the way she glanced toward the door more often than toward the counter. Hypervigilance, a map of experience written in reflexes, not words. He didn't need to know what happened, not yet. What mattered was that something had driven her away from where she came, and whatever it was, it left marks deeper than snow. Bear huffed softly, not impatient, but acknowledging the shift in the room. James followed his friend's gaze again, at the way the barista noticed the young woman but didn't ask questions, at the way other customers resumed conversations without offering space for someone who didn't quite fit. James tapped his fingers once against the mug, an old habit from briefing rooms. Then he leaned back, not to retreat, but to make the moment feel less fragile. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said. "No one's rushing you here." Her eyes flickered like she hadn't heard words like that in a long time, or hadn't believed them when she did. Snow thickened outside, erasing footprints almost as soon as they formed. Inside, something else formed, slow, fragile, but unmistakable. A space where a woman who ran could breathe, and a man who'd stopped running could remember why he once stood his ground. Bear closed his eyes briefly, as if stamping the moment into memory, not as a beginning or an ending, but as the first time in a long stretch of days that none of them felt entirely alone. And James, who had promised himself he would never again carry more weight than his own ghosts, realized with a strange ache that he had already broken that promise. He didn't mind. Not this time. James stayed still for a long while after Mia sat down, unsure whether silence was a refuge or a trap. He had spent years mistaking quiet for peace, only to learn that silence could smother just as effectively as noise. Mia held her crutch close, fingers curling around it, with the kind of grip that came from habit, not caution, like someone who had learned that dropping even one thing could make everything fall apart. Bear rested near her feet with a subtle alertness, not protective in the physical sense, but attuned to the rhythms of her breathing, as though making sure each breath continued. James tried to ignore how quickly the dog had attuned to her. He suspected Bear sensed what he himself would not yet admit. It was too early to think of responsibility, he told himself, too early to decipher meanings from body language or the way her gaze drifted to the exit, as if anticipating someone bursting in. But he caught the flicker every time the bell over the door rang, and it made him tense, memories of locked compounds and half-hidden threats whispering across his nerves. Mia traced a fingertip over the rim of her cup without drinking. Her shoulders almost relaxed, then tightened, as if she caught herself enjoying the warmth, as though part of her refused comfort she hadn't earned. James recognized the feeling too well. There had been mornings after deployments where he sat alone in diners, unable to name what gnawed at him, bitter coffee and empty plates, reminding him he was alive, yet somehow not fully present. Now he saw that same distance swimming behind Mia's eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was vigilance, sharpened over time by disappointment rather than immediate danger. When someone passed behind her chair too close, she flinched so lightly most would miss it. Bear didn't. His head rose and his ears shifted almost imperceptibly before he lowered them again, sensing there was no threat, but refusing to forget there could be. James stared into the cooling coffee and wondered why the stranger's presence unsettled him. Not in a bad way, but in a way that stirred something he had buried under layers of routine and resignation. He told himself it was empathy, nothing more, but empathy was often just a safer name for recognition. Without planning to, James spoke. "You're not from here," he said, and his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Mia inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the table, then answered with a small nod, as though agreeing with something much larger than the question. "Not anymore," she said. "I thought distance would help, but distance isn't the same as safety." The words struck him harder than he expected, because he had once learned that lesson on a return flight home, when the miles between war and peace did nothing to soften the echoes inside him. He wondered who had taught Mia the same thing. Before he could ask, the front door opened again, and the air shifted enough for Mia's posture to harden. A delivery driver entered, barely glancing around, but Mia's hands tensed as if preparing to defend herself with nothing more than the metal crutch resting against her chair. James saw the reaction and felt that old instinct rise up, the one that never truly left him, the one that had made him a reliable shield in a world that rewarded shields until they were no longer needed. He didn't like the way her shoulders lifted in anticipation. He didn't like that she noticed every sound before relaxing again. But he didn't comment. Sometimes acknowledgement felt like exposure, and he didn't want to take that from her. Instead, he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear, "He isn't looking for you." She nodded once, and though her breathing steadied, her fingers still pressed the cup too tightly. Bear shifted again, letting out a quiet exhale that seemed to say he wasn't sure whether to rest or stand guard. And James wondered if the dog was simply reflecting his own indecision. James cleared his throat and asked, "Do you have somewhere to go after this?" He hated how formal his voice sounded, like an officer interrogating instead of a man concerned. Mia hesitated, and for a heartbeat he thought she wouldn't answer, that the wall between them was too high. Then she said, "I have places I don't want to return to, and everywhere else feels temporary." James absorbed the words with a weight he hadn't expected. Temporary was something he knew intimately, sleeping in barracks, hostels, motels, rented rooms where he never unpacked more than essentials. He had mastered the art of belonging nowhere. It was liberating at first, until liberation became isolation, and the quiet between walls grew too loud. He took a sip of coffee that no longer tasted like anything, and wondered when comfort had become something he distrusted. Mia's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, snow blurred parked cars, erasing the sharp edges of the street, and James wondered whether the whiteness made her feel hidden or exposed. When he finally asked what brought her to Spokane, she responded with a tight shrug, as if the truth were too heavy to set down, yet too exhausting to keep carrying. "I just needed distance," she said, and her voice didn't shake, but the way her hand hovered near her crutch betrayed how hard she was holding herself together. James let the silence return. He didn't ask for details because he remembered how invasive questions could feel when someone wasn't ready to speak. He felt Bear's attention sharpen again, and he knew the dog sensed something building, not a threat, but a shift in the emotional air. Then, while still studying the window, as if searching her own reflection for permission, Mia whispered, "You don't have to answer this, but why did you say I could stay?" James didn't reply immediately. He felt the weight of the question settle between them. It wasn't about gratitude or curiosity. It was about trust, about whether bridges could still be built from places cracked by past harm. "Because I know what it's like to need space to breathe," he said finally, "and because no one should have to drink coffee standing up in the cold." It was a simple answer, but it felt heavier than that, even to him. Mia looked down, her eyes clearing just enough to suggest it meant something. James wondered why admitting that felt like stepping toward a line he had drawn years ago and promised never to cross again. The barista approached briefly to refill water at a nearby table. Mia watched her leave, then gathered enough breath to say, quietly but firmly, "I used to think staying silent kept me safe. I'm not sure anymore." James swallowed hard. The sentence hit him like something half-remembered from a past he thought he'd buried. Before he could form a response, Bear rose and nudged his leg with a restrained urgency, not alarmed but aware. James looked up, scanning the window instinctively, and saw someone outside pausing near the entrance, glancing in as though searching for someone specific. Mia froze, her hand tightening around the crutch until her knuckles whitened, and James felt every instinct he thought he'd retired surge awake. The door had not yet opened, but something heavier than snow settled in his chest. He leaned forward just slightly, voice steady but low enough only she could hear, "You don't have to face anything alone." Her breath caught, and then the bell above the door began to move. James felt the shift in Mia's posture before the door even opened, as if her body could sense danger faster than sight. The bell rang sharply, a small sound in an ordinary cafe, yet it cut through the space between them like a warning. A man stepped inside, not rushing, not searching frantically, but pausing just long enough to survey the room with the air of someone who believed his presence should matter. James registered the broad outline of work clothes, a jacket dusted with melting snow, and the hesitant gait of someone who knew this place but didn't come often. The barista gave a quick nod of recognition, calling him by first name as she passed, but nothing about him felt directly tied to Mia. Still, Mia's breathing caught, and her fingers tightened around her crutch until the faint tremor in her wrist seemed to pulse through the table. Bear observed the man without looking directly at him, anchoring himself close to Mia's leg, not as a shield, but as a reminder she was not unaccompanied. James lowered his gaze to his cup, giving Mia the space to decide whether fear or caution was speaking through her body. He'd learned long ago that asking the wrong question too early could seal someone's silence forever. The man walked toward the counter, exchanged a few low words with the barista, and James caught only fragments. Deliveries delayed, something about a broken heater at his workshop, the kind of conversation that belonged to everyday life, far removed from whatever weight Mia carried. But Mia didn't relax. When the man reached into his pocket to pay, her shoulders jerked slightly, as if she expected a gesture that never came. James spoke quietly, voice almost indistinguishable from the ambient noise. "If he's not the one, you don't have to stay on alert." Mia blinked, expression unreadable, and whispered back, "I don't always know until it's too late." The sentence wrapped around James's thoughts with the familiarity of an old regret he'd never articulated. He knew exactly what it meant to react after damage was done, to steel yourself only once the threat had already slipped through a crack in your guard. The stranger collected his drink and left without looking back, and the bell's second ring felt less like a warning than a release. But the tension didn't dissolve. It lingered around Mia like a shadow she couldn't shake off. James took a slow breath, grounding himself before he spoke. "Has anyone been looking for you since you left?" Mia's stare drifted toward her reflection in the window, where falling snow blurred her outline, making her seem half-transparent. "I left at night," she said softly. "I thought secrecy would protect me, but now I'm not sure if I disappeared cleanly or left traces behind." James wanted to ask what she feared most, being found or being forgotten. He didn't, because some questions needed to stay unspoken until the person holding them could bear the weight of the answer. Instead, he gestured toward her untouched drink. "Can you stay here for a while longer, or do you need air?" Mia let out a breath she might have been holding since the man entered. "I can stay," she said, though the certainty in her voice wavered. "I need to know I can sit somewhere without flinching every minute." Bear shifted into a more relaxed position, though his senses stayed engaged, every sound acknowledged and filed away. The instinct of something who understood danger didn't always bark before striking. A server brought fresh pastries to a nearby table, their aroma warming the air, and for a fleeting moment James expected hunger or curiosity to soften Mia's expression. Instead, she pressed her palm to her thigh, near the point where skin met metal beneath the fabric of her jeans. He saw the gesture for what it was, not pain, but memory. The weight of something forced upon her, then taken away, leaving behind a body she now felt required to defend. She noticed his gaze and spoke before he could ask. "Losing a limb is supposed to be the tragedy," she murmured. "But the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was realizing how people treated me after, like I owed them something for surviving." James felt his jaw tense. Too many times he had stood at military funerals, hearing strangers say how lucky someone was to come home alive, as if life itself were repayment, as if the price wasn't still being collected long after discharge. He remembered the faces of men who stopped trusting their own bodies because memory weighed more than muscle. He hadn't expected to find echoes of that in a young woman sitting across from him in a warm cafe. But there it was, familiar devastation wearing a different life. He chose his next words carefully. "You don't owe anyone anything for staying alive." She looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his tone, as though she expected gentleness instead. "Sometimes I forget that," she admitted. "Sometimes I think I survived wrong." James's mind flickered to nights overseas when he questioned his survival in quieter ways, not wishing for death, but wondering why his life had stayed intact while others fractured. He pressed his thumb into his palm beneath the table, grounding himself before he responded. "Survival isn't a test. There's no right way to pass." Bear lifted his head, exhaling slowly, and James felt their shared history ripple beneath his skin. The places they had walked through together, the promises they never said aloud. He wondered whether Mia sensed that weight in the air or simply recognized the tone of someone who spoke from somewhere deeper than sympathy. After a moment of stillness, Mia whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing next. I only know I can't go back." James didn't look away. Not going back is a start. It's more than most people manage. Snow thickened outside, erasing the tracks of the man who had come and gone. The world beyond the window felt distant, like a stage where people played lives too uncomplicated to understand the quiet battles fought in this small corner of the city. Mia turned her mug slowly, the ceramic warm beneath her hands, and James saw how exhaustion softened her guarded posture. He wondered how long she had been running, not in distance but in vigilance, every step measured by fear she never named. He wanted to ask what pushed her out the door that night, what words or actions finally made the air unbreathable, but he held back, sensing the line between curiosity and intrusion. Instead, he asked something simpler. "Do you have someone you would trust if you let yourself?" Mia's brow furrowed as though the question itself was foreign. "Trust isn't something I give anymore," she said. "It's something people have to earn without asking." James nodded once. "That's fair." Silence stretched again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like ground being cleared, even if only by inches. Bear shifted closer to James's boot, but kept his attention angled toward Mia, as though tracking the rhythm of her thoughts. James wrapped his hands around the mug again, warming fingers that felt stiff from too many winters spent in cold places, and tried to imagine what the rest of the day might look like if he didn't walk away when he stood up. The thought frightened him more than he was willing to admit. Mia glanced outside just as a flash of headlights passed, reflecting briefly against the window. She flinched, the movement small but unmistakable. She tried to disguise it, but James noticed. He didn't comment. Instead, he spoke with quiet certainty. "You're safe here right now," Mia swallowed, nodding once. "I want to believe that." "You will," James said, though the confidence in his voice surprised even him. Snow continued to fall, and the cafe lights flickered faintly, as if adjusting to the shifting weight of the afternoon. James watched Mia breathe more evenly with each passing minute, sensing her vigilance easing, not disappearing, just loosening enough to let warmth through. He wondered whether offering space counted as helping, or if he was merely delaying the inevitable moment she would leave again. He didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at him. Then Mia straightened slightly, eyes narrowing toward the window, as though she had seen something only she could recognize. Her fingers tightened around her crutch again, pulse quickening in her throat. James followed her gaze and felt the air in his lungs still. Someone stood outside, close enough to be waiting, too far to be identified, motionless against the falling snow. And Mia whispered, barely audible, "I think I've seen that coat before." James did not turn immediately when Mia whispered about the coat outside. Instead, he inhaled once, slow and deliberate, the way he used to steady himself before stepping out of a helicopter into unknown ground. Bear sensed the change in him and rose silently, leaning just enough toward Mia to signal readiness without crowding her. James let his gaze drift toward the window, as though casually checking the weather. The figure was gone, leaving only footprints already fading beneath the falling snow. Mia's hand tightened around her crutch, and James recognized the question forming on her lips before she voiced it. Was that really someone she knew, or was fear imprinting old shapes into any silhouette that lingered too long? He spoke before she spiraled inward. "Sometimes memory makes strangers look familiar," he said, his tone soft but grounded. But even as he said it, he couldn't dismiss the possibility she was right. Mia didn't reply. She looked back at her drink as if expecting it to deliver an answer she couldn't reach on her own. The cafe had grown quieter, customers leaving to beat the approaching storm, and the barista dimmed the overhead light slightly to match the shifting mood of the room. James took the moment to assess Mia's breathing. It was steadying, but vigilance pulsed beneath the surface, the kind that didn't fade simply because nothing happened. Bear remained seated, gaze fixed toward the door, ears tilting just enough to track movement outside. James wondered whether the dog was reading the snow or the silence, both capable of hiding things too easily. "You want to step outside for air?" he asked, though part of him feared the cold might sharpen her anxiety. Mia hesitated long enough for James to regret asking. Then she nodded with a quick exhale, as if deciding to face the uncertainty of outside rather than the uncertainty inside her own head. James stood, sliding his gloves back on, feeling the weight of habit settle over his movements. Bear moved beside him, a steady presence, though James sensed the dog's attention stayed half on Mia, half on whatever lingered at the back of her mind. Outside, winter pressed against them like a wall. The air made Mia's breath catch, and James felt an old instinct flare as he watched her recalibrate to the cold and the unevenness of snow underfoot. They stepped beneath the awning to avoid the worst of the falling flakes, and Mia's gaze swept the sidewalks, as though mapping the world for threats she could not name aloud. James leaned against the railing, giving her space to breathe without feeling observed. The twilight turned Spokane into a blur of white and shadow. Cars crawled past, exhaust misting toward the sky, and for a fleeting moment James imagined they were just two people lingering outside a cafe because neither wanted to return home yet. But he knew Mia didn't have a home to return to, and he wasn't sure what home meant for himself anymore. He forced the thought aside. "You said distance didn't give you safety," James said, watching her expression, not her posture. "What would safety look like if you could define it?" Mia didn't answer at first. The question seemed to push her inward, toward a place she rarely let herself go. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw but steady. "Safety is somewhere I don't have to brace myself every time someone raises their voice. Somewhere I don't need to calculate exits before I sit down. And somewhere I'm not punished for existing." James felt something inside him tighten as the words settled between them. He remembered barracks where soldiers wrote letters they never sent, places where silence and exhaustion shaped confessions that would never make it into military records. He understood that safety wasn't a roof or a lock. It was the absence of dread. Bear pressed his head lightly against James's leg, as if reminding him not to drown in memory. James blinked and returned his focus to Mia. "You're not being punished now," he said. His voice felt heavier than intended, as though layered with old promises he hadn't spoken in years. Mia nodded once, but her shoulders remained slightly raised, tension held like breath. Snowflakes collected on her hair and melted into dark strands. James found himself wanting to brush them off, not out of affection, but to prove she wasn't alone against the cold. He didn't move. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you want me to walk you somewhere?" Mia looked at him then, truly looked, and James felt the intensity of her gaze settle into his chest. "Walk me where?" she whispered. "I don't have anywhere that feels like a destination." James understood the weight of that better than he wanted to. He reached for the railing and tightened his grip until the cold metal bit into his palm. "You don't need a destination tonight," he said. "Just the choice not to walk alone." Mia closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something in her posture loosened just enough to be noticeable. She didn't smile, but the strain around her mouth softened. Bear stepped slightly closer, a subtle shift of weight that spoke of acceptance. For a moment, the world felt suspended, as if the snow were holding its breath too. Then a distant engine cut through the quiet. A car slowed near the curb, headlights sweeping across the entrance of the cafe. Mia's entire body tensed. James straightened, instinct sharpening his senses. The car lingered longer than necessary before accelerating toward the intersection. James watched until it disappeared, analyzing the rhythm of its movement with a practiced eye. When he looked back at Mia, she was staring at the ground, breath shallow. "Did you recognize it?" he asked. Mia shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I see danger where there isn't any." James responded without hesitation. "Sometimes danger hides in places where people refuse to look." Mia turned her face toward him, eyes uncertain. He wondered whether she was searching for reassurance or permission to feel what she felt. Bear leaned against James with measured weight, not pushing, simply anchoring. James placed a gloved hand near Mia's arm without touching. The gesture was intentional, giving space while offering presence. "If you want, we can stay here a little longer," he said. Mia nodded again, but this time there was something like resolve beneath it. She lifted her crutch and shifted her weight in a controlled movement, turning back toward the cafe door. James followed, Bear moving between them and the street, as though drawing a boundary only he understood. The warmth inside greeted them once more, but neither sat immediately. James watched Mia look around the room, measuring who was still there, who had left, who might return. Her breathing slowed gradually, and James felt some of his own tension mirror the release. The barista called last order for the evening crowd, her tone gentle but firm. Mia hesitated, then glanced at James. "Do you think coffee keeps people awake because of caffeine, or because it gives them a reason not to go home?" James considered the question longer than necessary. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe staying awake is a way of delaying something." Mia lowered her gaze, but her voice was clear. "I've been delaying the truth for too long." James's pulse shifted. "Are you ready to name it?" Mia's hand trembled on her crutch. "Not yet," she said, "but I think I'm ready to stop running." James didn't speak. He didn't need to. Bear exhaled, a soft acknowledgement that seemed to settle somewhere in Mia's chest. Outside, the snow thickened again, swallowing the street in white. Mia looked at the window, then at James, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "If I tell you why I left, will you believe me?" The cafe lights flickered once, as though the building itself sensed something shifting. James met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Yes." Mia swallowed hard, and for the first time since she walked in, she did not look at the door or the window or anyone else. She looked only at him. Then her voice cracked open, barely audible. It wasn't an accident. For a moment after Mia whispered those words, neither of them moved. The hum of the cafe heater filled the silence, and James felt his breath steady, even as something inside him tightened. He had heard confessions like this before, spoken in barracks at 2 a.m., murmured during patrols when darkness loosened tongues, admitted in quiet hallways where shame clung to every syllable. But something about Mia's voice held a fragility he didn't dare interrupt. Bear sat close, gaze shifting between them, sensing the thickening air the way he once sensed tension before a mission. Mia swallowed hard, fingers gripping her crutch as if anchoring herself. "I knew the truth before anyone said it out loud," she whispered. "I just didn't let myself believe it, because believing meant I had to act." James let the words settle, not forcing rhythm or comfort. He knew sometimes the mind spoke in fragments, because that was all it could manage without breaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, steady, a deliberate contrast to the storm building behind her expression. "You don't have to explain everything tonight, but you can, if you want." Mia closed her eyes, exhaling through clenched teeth. "Not explaining feels like hiding," she murmured, "and I'm tired of hiding from my own story." James watched her shoulders rise and fall, each movement a negotiation between restraint and release. Bear crept closer to her chair, not touching, but near enough that she could lean if she needed. The barista passed by, asking if they needed anything before closing. Mia's voice faltered mid-sentence, her expression tightening again. James thanked the barista with a nod, waiting until the woman drifted away to stack cups near the counter before turning back to Mia. "You left because someone hurt you, that much is clear. But the way you said it, it wasn't an accident." Mia's jaw tensed, her gaze locked on the window as though replaying old scenes reflected behind the glass. "I used to think accidents were random," she whispered, "that they didn't have intent. But sometimes there's intent in the way someone refuses to see you." James understood instantly. Neglect could be as violent as force. Omission could bruise deeper than impact. He leaned forward slightly, not intruding, but ready to catch words she might drop if they became too heavy. Mia's voice trembled. He, my stepfather, liked control more than responsibility. When things didn't go his way, She stopped herself, jaw clenching. James resisted the instinct to fill the silence. He let her pace herself, let her breath guide the story instead of pushing it into shape. Mia looked down at the hand that held her mug, eyes distant. "He always said people like me make trouble just by existing, that I should be grateful I wasn't dead, after the first time. James felt a surge of anger coil through his chest. He pressed his fingertips into the wooden table to ground himself. Bear shifted closer, sensing the shift inside James as well. But Mia didn't see the dog or James. She was staring inward, lost somewhere between memory and realization. "I walked behind the car," she continued quietly, "but I didn't walk into its path. I was pushed." The words shook, but they came out whole. "My stepfather said it was an accident." My aunt repeated it. And I believed it because trusting myself hurt more than trusting them. James felt as if the room had narrowed to a single point. He knew the pattern, a child coerced into doubting their own perception, molded by people who claimed to care while twisting the truth into something weaponized. He spoke carefully, measuring every word. "What you're saying, it deserves to be heard. But what matters right now is what you feel telling it." Mia braced her crutch against her shoulder, breathing unevenly. "I feel like if I stop talking, I'll convince myself none of this happened. And if I keep talking, I'll fall apart." James nodded once. "Falling apart isn't failure," he said. "It's sometimes the first honest thing we do." Bear nudged Mia's leg lightly, the softest gesture, and she inhaled sharply, as if reminded she was occupying space someone considered worth holding. Outside, a distant horn blared, muffled by snow. The barista dimmed another row of lights, signaling closing time was approaching. James checked the time only to realize he hadn't looked at his watch in hours. A rare thing. When Mia stood, her balance wavered. James rose instinctively, one hand hovering close without touching, allowing her to determine the distance. She steadied herself, breath trembling. "I don't want to sleep outside again," she admitted. "Not tonight. I don't know if I'll be safe with my thoughts if I'm alone." James understood instantly. Loneliness could be more dangerous than any stranger. He nodded once. "You don't have to be alone. Not tonight." Mia met his gaze with raw caution. "Where would we go?" James hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because the implications felt weighty. "I have a place, not far. It's not much, but it's quiet." Mia's breath caught. "Why would you trust me like that?" He held her gaze without flinching, letting honesty speak. "Because I've seen what silence does to people, and I won't watch you sink under it." Mia's eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with a recognition that trust, once shattered, could still be rebuilt grain by grain. She nodded slowly, grip tightening on her crutch. Bear stepped forward as though accepting an unspoken agreement, positioning himself between them and the exit. The barista called final closing, her voice warm but weary. Mia exhaled, then whispered, "I'm ready." They stepped toward the door together, but before James could push it open, Mia grabbed his sleeve lightly, her voice barely carried. "If he finds me—" She didn't finish the sentence. James held her gaze, steady as winter stone. Then he answered with quiet certainty, "If he finds you, he'll have to get through me first." Mia's breath hitched, somewhere between fear and relief. Bear lifted his head, as if acknowledging the vow. James reached for the handle, but the door trembled faintly. Someone on the other side had just tried it before stepping away. James hesitated only long enough to read the tension in Mia's eyes before opening the cafe door, scanning left and right in a single fluid motion that came from years of needing to know where danger might emerge. The sidewalk was empty, wind brushing trails of snow across footprints that already blurred into nothing. Whoever had been there left no trace except the unease lingering in Mia's posture. Bear stepped forward first, his body still, gaze pointed down the street as if waiting for movement that never came. James didn't ask whether Mia wanted to keep looking. He sensed she was caught between wanting certainty and fearing what certainty might reveal. Instead, he said gently, "Let's go," and Mia nodded, tightening her grip on the crutch with the determination of someone who refused to let fear dictate her next step. The walk to James's truck was slow but steady. Mia testing her balance on patches of ice, while Bear stayed close enough that she could feel his presence without relying on it. James unlocked the passenger door and waited without touching her, resisting the instinct to help unless she asked. She didn't ask, but when her hand trembled as she pulled herself into the seat, James steadied the doorframe, not her body, giving her the space to maintain control. Once inside, Mia leaned her head back, eyes closed as though bracing against thoughts rather than cold. James started the engine, heater rumbling awake, warm air slowly pushing back winter's chill. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence felt dense but not suffocating. Mia's breath steadied as she watched snow collect on the windshield, her reflection faint and wavering in the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but anchored by resolve. "I didn't tell anyone before," she said. "Not everything. Not what truly happened." James adjusted his grip on the steering wheel but didn't turn toward her. He knew direct eye contact could sometimes feel like pressure. "You told enough tonight," he replied. "Enough for me to know you shouldn't go back alone." Mia let out a shaky breath and the muscles in her jaw relaxed just slightly. Bear glanced toward her from the back seat, his presence a silent reassurance, as though reminding her she wasn't stepping into another unknown, empty space. The drive through Spokane felt longer than usual. Streetlights flickered past like memories half-remembered, and the truck's heater hummed steadily, filling the cab with warmth that seemed to nudge Mia out of silence. "I always thought leaving made me weak," she murmured, "like I failed to endure what others expected me to." James caught her words as though recognizing a language he hadn't spoken in years. "Sometimes surviving means leaving before someone finishes breaking you," he said, "and staying is what destroys you." Mia stared at him, brows drawn, as if weighing whether to accept the truth she heard in his tone. When she finally nodded, it wasn't agreement, it was recognition. Snow thickened, forcing James to slow as they crossed the bridge over the icy river. Mia's gaze lingered on the water below, shadows shifting beneath frozen layers. Without turning from the road, James asked quietly, "Do you regret leaving?" Mia's answer came without hesitation. "No, I regret not leaving sooner." The words shook slightly at the edges, but determination threaded through them. James felt something inside himself tighten, not pity, but a kind of solemn respect. Bear let out a soft sound from the back seat, neither a whine nor a growl, more like an instinctual acknowledgement of a truth spoken aloud. Mia glanced at him, and for the first time that night her lips curved very faintly, a fleeting expression that disappeared as quickly as it came. When James pulled into the driveway of a modest older house near a stand of leafless trees, Mia sat forward, her breath catching as though stepping across a threshold she'd never imagined. The house was dimly lit, quiet, unadorned, but the porch light glowed against the snow like a small defense against darkness. James turned off the engine but didn't move to exit. Instead, he held Mia's gaze just long enough to make sure she had control of her decision. "If you want to change your mind, this is the moment," he said. "Staying is a choice. Leaving is also a choice." Mia's grip tightened on her crutch, and she exhaled slowly. "I've been choosing fear for too long. I'm tired of it." James felt something inside settle, not relief, not triumph, just a quiet resolve that echoed her own. He stepped out first to circle around and open her door, but stopped short of offering his hand. Mia moved at her own pace, and when she stepped onto the snow-packed path, Bear aligned himself at her side, not guiding, but walking beside her, with the steady awareness of someone who understood what crossing a threshold meant. Inside, the warmth of the entryway washed over them. Mia stood still for a long moment, looking around as though searching for signs of danger that weren't there. James waited without speaking, letting her decide whether the space felt safe enough to breathe in. After a breath that trembled but didn't break, Mia whispered, It feels strange to be somewhere quiet. James nodded once. Quiet can be safe or dangerous, he said. Tonight, it's safe. Mia lowered herself onto a chair near the window, her legs stretched carefully before her. Bear settled at her feet with a soft exhale, not guarding, but grounding. James removed his jacket and hung it by the door, his movements calm, measured. He sensed the question forming in Mia's expression before she spoke. "Do you think he's looking for me?" James met her gaze, the weight of experience shaping his tone. The people who hurt others often care more about control than presence. If he's looking, it's not because he misses you. Mia blinked hard, her breath uneven for a few seconds before stabilizing. She didn't cry, but the strain around her eyes softened, like someone finally acknowledging they'd stopped pretending. James brewed tea, placing a cup near her without comment. Mia stared at it as though unsure whether warmth was truly allowed. When she whispered "thank you," her voice barely carried, but it didn't tremble. James sat across from her, hands wrapped around his own cup. Silence settled, no longer heavy, just shared. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footprints that once traced paths back to places Mia refused to return. Bear shifted closer to her chair, his breathing steady and slow, and for the first time, Mia didn't flinch at the darkness pressing against the windows. Instead, she leaned back, inhaling deeply, and whispered, almost to herself, "I think I can sleep tonight." James didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded once, sensing the magnitude hidden in her words. But before the night could soften into quiet, Mia lifted her head sharply, eyes locking onto the window as though feeling rather than seeing something. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Bear raised his head, ears tilting toward the silence outside, and James's muscles tensed, not with panic but readiness. He stood slowly, stepping toward the hallway light switch, aware of the moment balancing between calm and alarm. Mia's breath hitched. James didn't turn around as he reached for the switch, voice low, steady, controlled. "Stay here." Then the lights went out. Night lay over the house like a held breath, snow muting every sound beyond the glass, while the sudden darkness inside deepened every shadow. For a long heartbeat, nobody moved. James stood with his hand on the light switch, muscles coiled, listening. He heard the faint hum of the fridge, the ticking of the baseboard heater cooling, Mia's sharp inhale on the other side of the room, and beneath it all the low, focused attention in Bear's breathing as the dog shifted from rest to readiness. Power failure, James thought first, but the heater was still on. The house had not gone completely dark, only the main lights had cut out, leaving a dim spill from the hallway and a dull glow from the kitchen. That meant the breaker or the switch, not the grid, or something else. He spoke into the silence, voice low, controlled. "Stay where you are." Mia did not answer, but he heard the soft slide of her hand tightening on the crutch, the rustle of fabric as she turned toward where she remembered the door to be. Bear moved before James did, not toward the window or entrance, but to place himself directly between Mia and the main hallway, as if his instincts decided that her fear was the priority, not whatever lurked outside. James crossed to the small cabinet near the kitchen and pulled open a drawer by feel. His fingers closed around a flashlight and the familiar shape of a tool he kept more for habit than for need these days, a heavy metal wrench that fit well in his hand. Old reflexes slotted into place. He moved to the front window first, angling the beam low along the edge of the curtain so the light would not silhouette him. Snow swirled in the cone of brightness, but there was no figure waiting, no car idling nearby, only a quiet street, blanketed and indifferent. He checked the back door, the sliding glass to the small yard, the side gate. Nothing out of place except his own pulse, a little faster than he preferred. The sound Mia had heard might have been ice shifting on the roof or a branch brushing the gutter. It might have been. His instincts told him to treat it as more anyway. When he returned to the living room, Mia was still seated but rigid, eyes attuned to the faint light from the hallway. "Did you see anyone?" she asked, voice thin but steady. "No," James answered, and the truth felt both reassuring and incomplete. "Nothing obvious. That does not mean no one tried the door." Her jaw clenched. He found the breaker panel, flipped the appropriate switch, and the lights returned with a soft click as the room fell back into color and definition. The sudden clarity made the fear in Mia's face more visible, not less. James set the flashlight down, feeling the decision crystallize inside him. They were no longer in a place where caution alone would suffice. Keeping her hidden could quickly turn into keeping her trapped. "You need more than distance," he said quietly. "You need this on record." Mia blinked, confusion flickering. "On record." He nodded. "Someone pushed you in front of a car. That someone has not been held accountable. Your stepfather should not have the power to decide which version of events survives." Her hand trembled slightly on the crutch. "You think he is here?" "I think men like him are used to being believed," James replied. "If he realizes you are gone, he may decide fear is the best way to drag you back. I would rather act before he tries than wait and react afterward." Bear lifted his head and gave a short, quiet sound, as if seconding the thought. James took out his phone, the weight of what he was about to do settling into his bones with familiar gravity. He scrolled to a contact he had hoped to keep in the past. Aaron Hayes, a former teammate who had traded covert operations for federal investigations, a man who knew how systems failed and how to push them until they worked. Mia watched him with wary eyes. "Who are you calling?" "Someone who owes me a favor and knows the difference between an accident and a crime," James said. He stepped into the hallway to give her space, but his voice stayed low enough that the words carried back into the room. When Aaron answered, the years between deployments collapsed into a single beat of recognition. "You only call this late when it is serious," Aaron said. "It is," James replied. He laid out the essentials as cleanly as he could. A young woman with a prosthetic leg, a stepfather with a pattern of control, a supposed accident that sounded less and less accidental the more Mia spoke, bruises, the way her story had been overwritten by the adults who held power over her. Aaron listened, interjecting, only to ask clarifying questions, his tone sharpening in all the places James expected it to. At the end, there was a pause. "Do not bring her near that house," Aaron said. "I will contact a detective I trust in your area and a social worker who does not sleepwalk through cases. Expect calls in the morning. And James, do not let anyone without a badge near her tonight." "I was not planning to sleep anyway," James replied. When he returned to the living room, Mia looked smaller somehow, not because she had shrunk into herself, but because speaking had stripped away the armor she had been wearing. "Did you just change everything?" she asked quietly. "No," James said. "You did. When you decided to tell the truth, this just makes sure it does not disappear." She nodded slowly, eyes flickering toward Bear, who had settled again at her feet, not relaxed but watchful, in a way that seemed to come from old training and deeper loyalty. The rest of the night passed in fragments of conversation and long stretches of quiet. Mia dozed eventually, head resting against the back of the chair, her crutch leaning within reach. Bear remained alert longer than James, but eventually even his breathing eased. James sat by the window, the rifle of his past replaced by a simple resolve. He would not fail her the way others already had. Morning came pale and flat over the snow-blanketed street. It did not feel like a new beginning, just a continuation with slightly better odds. A call from Aaron confirmed that a local detective named Clean and a child protection worker named Claire would meet them at the hospital, where Mia's injuries could be documented properly before any confrontation with her stepfather. The name hospital made Mia stiffen, But James explained the purpose, emphasizing that this time she would not be alone in sterile corridors with adults who spoke over her. He would be there, Bear would be there, as far as policy allowed. At the hospital, under harsh but honest light, a doctor examined Mia's residual limb, the pressure sores from an ill-fitted prosthetic, the old and new bruises layered across her skin. He spoke clinically, but there was anger in the way he noted down findings, in the way he measured what never should have been allowed to happen. Detective Kleine, reserved and deliberate, listened to Mia's account without rushing her, asking questions that sought clarity, not contradiction. Claire, the social worker, stayed at Mia's side, explaining each step before it happened, making sure consent was not merely assumed. James observed with a cautious detachment, his instincts always half-turned toward doors and unfamiliar faces, but a part of him was quietly relearning that institutions, while flawed, could sometimes bend toward justice when the right people were involved. When word came that officers had visited Mia's house and found locks on the outside of her bedroom door and financial records that made no moral sense, James watched something shift in Mia's expression. It was not joy. It was recognition that, for once, reality was aligning with what she remembered rather than what she had been told to believe. The legal machinery that followed did not move quickly, but it moved. Her stepfather faced charges that did not disappear with a shrug. Her aunt could no longer hide behind ignorance. Statements were filed, hearings scheduled. Through it all, Mia's fear did not vanish, but it no longer ruled every breath. She had witnesses now. She had someone who chose to stand between her and the darkness when it reached back for her. Months later, when spring finally began prying winter from Spokane's grip, James watched Mia step out into his small backyard without her crutch for the first time. Her gait was still uneven, her progress measured, but each step carried a different weight now. Not the weight of escape, but of choice. Bear moved beside her with instinctive precision, matching his pace to hers, ready to brace if she faltered, but never forcing support upon her. Claire visited sometimes, not in a professional capacity, but as someone who cared about follow-through. Aaron called now and then to check in, half teasing James for retiring into domesticity, half relieved that one more person was no longer invisible to the system. In court, when the question of guardianship arose, the judge had looked directly at Mia and asked where she felt safest. Mia had glanced toward James, toward Bear sitting obediently outside the doors, and answered with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Here, with him. In that moment, James felt the old weight of responsibility settle into something different, not a mission, not an obligation imposed from above. A choice, one he made freely, one he did not regret. Now, as twilight softened the edges of the fence and the sky colored itself in faint bands of gold and gray, Mia reached the far side of the yard and turned back, breathing hard but standing without support. Her eyes shone with effort rather than fear. "I never thought walking toward something could feel better than running away," she said. James smiled, a small, honest curve of his mouth he rarely allowed. "That is because this time you are walking toward your life, not away from danger." She looked at him as if weighing the truth of that statement against everything she had lived through. Then she nodded, and some invisible thread loosened. Bear huffed softly, content, and lay down between them, facing the gate, as though guarding against threats even in peace. James looked at the small house behind them, the worn porch, the light glowing in the kitchen. It was not perfect, it was not grand, but it was theirs. For someone who had spent years drifting between deployments and temporary addresses, the permanence of another human being choosing to stay was both terrifying and deeply right. Mia took another cautious step forward, wobbling, then steadied herself. For a brief second, she seemed to balance between the girl who left home in the night and the woman building a new one here. Then she moved toward him, closing the distance with the simple, stubborn courage that had carried her this far. When she reached him, she exhaled, a breath that sounded like release. "I am done being afraid of my own story," she said. James nodded once, feeling the truth of it resonate through the quiet yard. "Good," he answered, "because your story is not just about what he did. It is about who you chose to be after." Snowmelt dripped softly from the eaves as the last traces of winter surrendered. Mia glanced back at the house, then at Bear, then at James, and in that sequence of looks was an understanding that needed no further explanation. She was not alone. He was not drifting. And together they had built something that did not erase the past, but stood firmly beyond its shadow. For the first time in years, James felt that staying in one place was not a sign of stagnation, but of commitment. Standing there between the fading snow and the emerging grass, with Mia upright on her altered body and Bear keeping quiet watch, he realized that some battles were not fought for flags or nations, but for one person's right to stand in their own life without fear. That, he decided, was a mission worth seeing through to the end. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as burning bushes or thunder from the heavens, but as quiet choices made by ordinary people who refuse to walk away when someone needs them most. God's grace moves in ways we often overlook, in a hand offered before we fall, in a voice that believes us when others doubt, in the courage to choose healing over silence, and in the loyal presence of those who stay. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that faith is not only found in churches or prayers spoken on Sundays, it also lives in everyday acts of kindness that change the course of someone's life. Before you close this video, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a sign of hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. Subscribe to the channel so these messages of redemption and compassion can reach more hearts. May God bless you, guide your steps, guard your home, and place miracles, small or great, along the path you walk every single day.